All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Fida Adeli, and I'm an associate professor in the Clovis and Hala Maksud Chair in Arab Studies here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And along with my colleague, Dr. Mustafa Aksakal, right? Along with my colleague, Mustafa Aksakal, who's an associate professor of history, and the Nasuhi Erdogan Chair of Modern Turkish Studies. I am introducing Sam, but Mustafa and I helped make this happen, right? And the two of us will start us off with some questions after Sam's presentation, and then open it up to the audience, leading a conversation about his book, soon to be released book, Locusts of Power Borders, Empire and Environment in the Modern Middle East. Dr. Samuel Dolbee is an environmental historian of the late Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East. He's currently an assistant professor of history at Vanderbilt University. He has articles that have appeared in the American Historical Review, Past and Present, and the International Journal of Middle East Studies. His book will be released any day now. That's correct. It's waiting on paper. It's a paper shortage has delayed it. Yeah, any day now with Cambridge University Press. He completed his PhD in history and Middle Eastern Islamic Studies at NYU, New York University, and his MA here in Arab Studies at Georgetown University, where he was also my research assistant. I have to say that. We worked really closely together, and I'm very excited to hear about his work tonight. So his MA was here, and he was also editor-in-chief of the Ottoman History podcast. He will talk a bit about the book and his work, and then, as I said, we'll start with a few questions from myself and Mustafa Aksakal, and then we'll have time to open it up for questions. If you're joining in person, just raise your hand and we'll address as many of the questions as possible. And to our online audience, please ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and our event manager will direct them to me. If you have any technical issues, you can also email our events manager, Coco Tate, at coco.tait@georgetown.edu. And this information will also be in the chat if you need to reference it. Okay, all right, welcome everyone, and welcome Sam, and we look forward to hearing about your project.
Thanks so much, Frida. I want to begin by saying how strange and also wonderful it is to be here tonight. Strange because of how much suffering is going on right now in the borderlands of Syria and Turkey that this book is in large part about. It's also wonderful to be here in community, see so many people from different parts of my life. And it's also wonderful to be in this room specifically, because I remember 14 and a half years ago, maybe sitting over in that corner over there, when I was starting the Masters in Arab Studies program. And I was sitting next to Nadim Bawalsa, whose excellent book just came out last year. And all of the faculty introduced themselves, and Nadim and I looked at each other and just, wait, we can just take classes with them? Like, we can take classes with Judith Tucker? Like, we can do it? So it's somewhat surreal to be here. And also, I should add that my first encounter with environmental history happened with John McNeil. I think on this very floor, a windowless room in the ICC was the place where it started. So this is all to say that I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to see so many people. I want to thank Coco, Fida, Mustafa for making this possible. And I want to thank all of you for being here. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about the general idea of the book, how I came to write it, main interventions, and then a few cases that will hopefully bring the bigger points into relief. And I should say here too, that unfortunately the book is not a physical thing yet because of unforeseen production delays. But you can see here a draft of the book cover, which I quite like. And it is now available for pre-order on the Cambridge University Press website. The paperback version is available for pre-order. But also, if it's out of your price range, just email me and I'll send you a PDF. Okay, I think I've probably sufficiently undermine the effort to sell books. Yes. Okay, so Locusts of Power. This is an environmental history of borders in the late Ottoman Empire and after. It follows locusts to offer a history of the modern Middle East in a way that is not bounded by the state categories of space and time that so often shape what we know. And here's an example of one of these Moroccan locusts, as they're called, that are particularly powerful in this region called the Jazira. So the range of these locusts, which you can see here, it roughly coincides with this space known as the Jazira. And so this is the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates at the foot of the Anatolian Plateau. There are a number of borders on here in confusing ways, both Ottoman provinces of Aleppo, Zor, Mosul, Diyarbakir, and also the post-Ottoman states in this space, the French Mandate of Syria, British Mandate of Iraq, and the Republic of Turkey. So this is a borderlands region. It's also a region that has a long history. So in medieval geographies, for example, you see the Jazira talked about alongside place names that are still used and known today, like Egypt and Iraq. And what I'll say is, in addition to revealing this space that did not fit easily with borders, locusts also reveal a number of intricate relationships with moving people. So each chapter of the book focuses on the relationship between locusts and a certain group of people who were compared or compared themselves to locusts. And these people include Arabic and Kurdish speaking nomadic pastoralists, Armenian deportees, Assyrian refugees. So the image on the cover of the book is a little misleading in the sense that it presents these locusts without any people in the background, because this is a book that is very much about the interconnection between non-humans and humans. So I traced this relationship between 1858 and 1939, and in the process explain how the region went from one of nomadic sedentarization campaigns to the killing fields of the Armenian genocide during World War I, to a site of refugee resettlement in the interwar period, and then to the most agriculturally productive lands of Syria in the 20th century, and finally more close to the present, the heartland of ISIS. And over this same time period, that being the shorter time period of the book, 1858 and 1939, the locust in this region is essentially eradicated. And it's eradicated both due to an expansion of cultivation and an increase in the use of arsenic compounds as insecticides. So those are the kind of broad arcs of the book. As with any project, this is not the book I set out to write when I began my dissertation research in 2010. At that point, fresh off the heels of MAAS, I wanted to work on Syrian history. But very quickly after 2011, it became clear that that was not going to be possible for me, at least. And so I began studying Turkish and Ottoman. And as I began my work in Turkey in the early 2010s, I was struck by all of these connections between Syria and Turkey that were at once present, but also in other ways invisible. And one example of these connections was in the realm of pistachios. Here you can see a very cute marketing effort by a New York-based importer to convince Americans that they should eat pistachios in the early 20th century. You see pistachio face, fez, sword, very nice slippers. Connections between Syria and Turkey and pistachios. In Syria, I knew the famous pistachios were from Aleppo, Fıstık Halabi, right? In Turkey, they're from Antep, from Gaziantep, Antep fıstığı. Aleppo and Antep, they're 100 kilometers apart, approximately. They're part of the same Ottoman province. And there was something that was powerful to me about the way that these were essentially the same pistachios, essentially the same environment. yet they're circulating in different national economic spaces. They have different names even. And this had me thinking about environments and commodities maybe across borders. Another moment of crystallization occurred as I was going through uncatalogued materials in the Ottoman archives. And I came across this map, which looked both strange and familiar to me. It's ripped at the bottom, which might be interesting to some people, or make it seem more interesting. It looked familiar to me because these lines here look exactly like the border between Syria and Turkey. It looks strange to me because I knew it was an Ottoman map, and that there were no real borders between Syria and Turkey during the Ottoman Empire. And so what it turns out this is a map of is the path of the Baghdad Railway. So this was this project in the late Ottoman Empire to rejuvenate the empire by connecting Berlin and Baghdad via rail. Project was not completed until after the war. And also the railway that was completed came to serve a curious purpose in the wake of World War I. Because there wasn't any other agreeable dividing line between what would become Syria and Turkey, the path of the Baghdad Railway came to actually serve as the border between Turkey and Syria for several hundred miles. And that's still the case today. So there was something about this fact that this infrastructural project that was intended to rejuvenate the late Ottoman Empire, it actually served as the literal dividing line of these states in the post-Ottoman context. That captured me. And so these points about environmental connections and late Ottoman influences on post-Ottoman borders appealed to me for a few reasons that have ended up being the main interventions of this project. First is the way that borders are generally talked about in big histories of the Middle East. And this is less any one book or scholar and more what you'll see on op-ed pages or in survey courses. And that's the idea of a fluid Ottoman space followed by a rigidly nationalist post-Ottoman space. Often presented as being imposed by European colonizers. Of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the midst of World War I, this Anglo-French agreement to decide on how the Ottoman Empire should be divvied up after the war. This is often presented as the symbol of this, this way of talking about borders in the Middle East. This is kind of seen as the original sin by many people. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. I remember at some point I was teaching World War I, and I was going through all of these wartime agreements, Hussein-McMahon, Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, and I said, okay, you got it down? Okay, let's move on. And a student raised their hand and they said, wait, the British were lying. And I said, yes, they are. And so there is that aspect to this story, certainly. But what I'll suggest today is that for all the truth of this story, it obscures what borders actually look like in people's everyday lives. How people who lived before these borders and how people who lived after these borders understood them, evaded them, didn't notice them. And there's a broader historiographical point here too, which is that this big narrative of fluid Ottoman space to rigid post-Ottoman space is in some ways unintentionally buttressed by a scholarly division of labor. And this is changing, but what I mean is a separation between Ottoman and post-Ottoman, a separation between Syria and Iraq, a separation between Aleppo province and Diyarbakir province, separation between Ottoman and Arabic, although that's changing. And there are, of course, many good reasons to use these frames to tell history, practical ones even. But there's also a way that it can produce a kind of scholarly myopia, and one that moreover reproduces state ways of seeing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So as a result of this division of labor, I would suggest that certain people and places and creatures have fallen through the cracks. So the research for this book is based on archival material in Ottoman, Arabic, French, German, modern Turkish, based on state archives, but also the League of Nations, Natural History Museum in London, various missionary archives. And part of the work that I did archivally for the book was to read around state categories of space, which meant looking, not just for files on Aleppo or Diyarbakir separately, but trying to put them all together. And what began to appear when I looked at these files together was a group of nomads or a swarm of locusts would appear in one province, and then they would appear in another, and then they would appear in another. And there's a way that if you imagine state officials squinting from their provincial capital at these nomads moving on the edge, or these swarms of locusts moving on the edge, you might see that they would understand these groups as marginal in the sense of not being all that important. But part of what I'm suggesting is that these moving people and locusts were actually marginal in a literal sense. They were on the edge. They were on the edge in a way that was political, in the sense that they were often on the edges of these provincial borders, moving between Aleppo and Diyarbakir. They were also on the edge environmentally, in the sense that they were moving between land that was cultivated and land that was not, and land that was described as desert. So my argument about borders is that they shaped space long before Sykes-Picot, and that they didn't necessarily shape space as rigidly as we might think after Sykes-Picot. And central to both of these points is this methodological point of trying to follow people who didn't want to be followed. Nomads, Armenian genocide survivors, refugees, all people for whom, for different reasons, they wanted to disappear. And in large part, they did. And in this sense, the Jazira was a locus of power for all of these marginal groups. The other big point I want to make is about environmental history, which is, of course, a burgeoning field in Ottoman and Middle East history, in no small part, thanks to a lot of work that's happening in this building. What I want to say in this regard is that a work that has been a part of this trend and also a part in the sense of being distinct, I think, is Tim Mitchell's famous essay, Can the Mosquito Speak? In Rule of Experts. As with many things that Tim Mitchell writes, it's beautiful and provocative and sort of difficult to know what to do with. This is another thing, as an early stage MAAS student, I was very excited and also very confused when I first read that. In my case, what many people have done with this essay is they've suggested to me that I should use this as my title, Can the Locust Speak? Which I have not done. Of course, when Mitchell kind of playfully asks this question, he has bigger stakes in mind than simply the point that locusts can, or mosquitoes can affect the world. He's talking about, can social theory grapple with all of this, given its baggage in the 19th century? What I'll suggest is something slightly different, which is, one, certainly locusts can speak if we understand that to mean have some sort of impact on the world. They blot out the sun, they destroy crops. They particularly destroy cotton crops in the midst of the American Civil War. They do all these things. So yes, certainly locusts have a material impact on the world. But something that's really struck me while working on this project is that in addition to speaking, locusts are constantly spoken for. So people are constantly talking about them. People are not only constantly talking about them, they're comparing other people to them. They're denigrating people by comparing them to locusts. They are expressing frustration with their own prospects. So a broader point that I want to make here, particularly for people who are maybe less familiar with environmental history or suspicious of it even, I'm not reading the science of today to expose these things that are unseen in the past. These are things that people are constantly talking about, and it's actually hard to not see it once you start to see it. With those kind of big framing points in mind, in the time that remains, I want to zoom in a little on some of the cases to give you a sense of the texture of some of these stories. So as I mentioned, the Jazira is an arid space right on the border of where rainfall allows for non-irrigated agriculture. In the mid-19th century, it's largely inhabited by tent-dwelling pastoralists who raise sheep and camels and move along with regional seasonal greenery to feed them and raise them. This black and white photo doesn't quite do justice to the verdant meadows that the Jazira is known for, but you see some nice backlit camels here. And this is the Shamar, which is a particularly significant group of Arabic-speaking pastoralists that moves all across the Jazira. Typically in April, these groups would move close to cities where they'd buy things like wheat, but also sell wool, butter, other animal products. The 19th century, this is of course also the time of the Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire. So these reforms aimed at doing things like clarifying land laws, clarifying provincial authority structures, clarifying how revenue got from soil to the state. And a big part of that process was making sure provincial borders were clear. And understandably, nomadic pastoralists could sometimes be a challenge with these borders, given how mobile they were. They could easily move from one province to another to avoid paying taxes. More problematically, they could move from one province to another and collect taxes of their own, as they did sometimes in relation to what they called the Hawa tax. So this looks differently in different parts of the empire, this broader reform effort. But what might be distinctive in the Jazira is how central the question of nomadic movement and provincial borders are. So to give you one sense of the different understandings of space in this region, this is a letter in Arabic from 1866 from a chief of this group, the Shamar, named Abdul Karim. It's kind of perhaps difficult to see now, but he says, "Nahnu shuyukh al-Jazira min Halab ila Bab Baghdad." So we are the sheikhs of the Jazira from Aleppo to the gates of Baghdad. Now, this Arabic letter that Abdul Karim or his secretary wrote, it gets translated into Ottoman. And the Ottoman translation actually says something quite different. It says, Baghdatan halabe kader bulunan ahaliye maskune min muhafizasana memur olub. So we are appointed to protect the settled people from Baghdad to Aleppo. These are different messages. There are a number of words that are left out between the original letter and the Ottoman translation. But maybe the most significant one to think about here is the Jazira. The Jazira, this word that is used by this Shamar leader as the kind of central part of his power, that totally disappears in the Ottoman translation. The Ottomans are seemingly only seeing these component parts of this broader space. They're seeing the administrative units through which they govern. And so a part of the story in the book is the formation of the Mutasarriflik of Deir ez-Zor in 1871, which is formed with the help of Tanzimat luminaries like Mithat Pasha and Jevdet Pasha. And it actually results in a huge revolt led by Abdul Karim. I can talk more about that if you want. But for now, what I'll emphasize is that this district was created with the specific idea of encompassing nomadic migration, and also the desert within it to root out the power that nomads got from, as I said, being on the edge, claiming to be a part of the Jazira rather than its smaller administrative parts. So this is one place where we can see a longer history of borders and contention over them before Sykes-Picot. Now, at the same time that officials are worried about nomads and worried about figuring out how to draw borders around this amorphous and arid environment, there's another emerging discourse about the region, And that is that the Jazira, this arid region that is a desert, in the late 19th century, to call a place a desert is not a neutral scientific description of a place, right? That means it's someone's fault for making it a desert. And in the Jazira, the people who are blamed are perhaps unsurprisingly nomads like the Shamar. The other reason why people are convinced that the Jazira could be something else are elevations all across the region that look like this. They're known as tal, little hills. So these are not naturally occurring geological formations. These are the accumulated dirt over centuries on ancient ruins. And so this is a photo of one of these formations in southern Turkey from 2014. But in the 19th century, when archaeologists and bureaucrats and state officials would see these formations, they saw it as evidence that this place could be something else. It could be different. It could be a flourishing civilization. Why aren't we growing wheat and cotton here? Why are there just these nomads who are moving around with their animals? Diana Davis has, of course, written about this in Resurrecting the Granary of Rome, about Algeria and this effort there, and this discourse there. And we can see some glimpses of this in the Ottoman Empire in terms of resurrecting a kind of granary of Assyria, if we want to think about it like that. Now, unknown to a lot of these advocates of expanding cultivation into the Jazira was the fact that these hills served another purpose. In fact, the locusts of the Jazira used these hills to lay eggs. So this particular species would generally hatch around March or April, and then depending on the weather and the precipitation, they would either remain solitary grasshoppers or they would transform as part of what is called gregarious state. Which I've always appreciated as a kind of funny term for this really horrific apocalyptic event that's caused. So a lot of people try to say, oh, it's every 10 years that they come, it's every 7 years that they come. There's not really any logic to it. These are all just efforts to kind of create some regularity. And of course, swarms appearing in March and April, that's a dangerous time. This is precisely when crops are becoming ripe, when wheat is ready for harvest. It's also when summer crops like cotton are being planted for the first time. And this is also tax season. So there's a way that locusts are embedded in this kind of choreography of value extraction going on here. I should also say that there's not much that humans can do against locusts at this point, at least. One method is simply plowing the land. With these locusts specifically, that dislodges the eggs from the soil. But the Jazira is so sparsely populated that that kind of effort is not going to happen. If you've watched Little House on the Prairie or you've read Little House on the Prairie, you might remember the locust scenes. And in that case, you'll know that in the late 19th century, the United States was dealing with locusts too, and there was not a very good solution to them either. One perhaps distinctive thing happening in the Ottoman Empire was a relationship with starlings. So there was this belief that a Sufi blessed holy water, sometimes coming from Konya, sometimes from other places, if it was brought to places hit by locusts and hung up in mosques, it would attract the starlings, and the starlings would attack the locusts. And there are these very kind of vivid accounts of battles between locusts and starlings in the 1860s and 1870s. And of course, this is describing a real relationship, right? Starlings eat locusts, and if there's a locust swarm, it's good to be a starling. So there's this deep connection between locusts and people and the local ecology. These hills that make humans dream of agricultural plenty. These are actually the very same hills upon which locusts mate and lay eggs, and then use them as kind of forward operating bases for the agriculture that's expanding toward them. So this isn't a story of humans versus nature. This is a story in which it's actually hard to draw a line between them, given the way that locusts are drawing power, both from an ancient human infrastructure and an expanding Ottoman state. And of course, locusts are also, like nomads, drawing power from the borders put in place in this space. The swarms are moving between Mosul, Diyarbakir, and Aleppo, and they're often leaving quarreling officials in their wake. Many of whom say, you know, these officials, they say, I did all of the required work in my district. And then the lazy governor in Mosul, that is the reason why the locusts came to Aleppo and destroyed everything. The lazy governor out east. This is a kind of refrain in bureaucratic correspondence. So there's a way that this dilemma epitomizes the difficulties and challenges of the Tanzimat, the Hamidian state, trying to create evenness throughout the empire, but also, of course, that was not a smooth process. And it also created openings for various groups to move, and in these cases, divide and rule the empire on some level, using these borders to create a space for themselves. So over the following decades, we see these patterns continuing with questions about how to manage moving populations and moving locusts. And the state is at times more flexible than others. Happy to talk more about what that looks like in Q&A. But what I want to do now is shift to World War I. Because at this point, this region that the Ottomans had been at various times trying to transform into something different than a desert, they began to use this space as a weapon in its own right. They use this space as the endpoint of the deportations that would become known as the Armenian genocide. So when I was doing the research for this project, and I mentioned this to some students beforehand, one of my challenges was just communicating with people about the geography that I was talking about. Because if I said I study the Jazira, people would say, okay, you study the Arabian Peninsula, Jazira al-Arabiya. Or they would say, oh, you study Jizre, this town in southeastern Turkey. And then I would resort to these like really convoluted, even if accurate terms. I'm studying the hinterlands of Mosul, Aleppo, and Diyarbakir. And then people would kind of nod and then like change the subject. But also when I would say this, sometimes people would know immediately what it was. And often when they did that, they would reveal something about themselves. They would say, oh, it's Rojava that you're talking about, right? It's this autonomous region of northeast Syria. Oh, of course, you're writing about the Armenian genocide. And these, of course, are not neutral things to bring up to a stranger in Turkey today or then. So there was something about this space as a kind of black hole of sorts that I encountered a lot. And it also has this function in terms of the genocide, right? The Jazira is the place where many Ottoman Armenians were deported to. And so while the space is in many ways forgotten, it's also very present in the memory of people who lived there, people who survived there, people who suffered there. And there's a way with the genocide that, given continuing state denial of this event, scholarship has been forced to prove that it happened, and in the process, it's kind of become disconnected from broader regional history. And yet what we can see in the Jazira are really long-term rhythms. In this cataclysmic event, we can see these longer-term rhythms as Armenians both suffered and tenaciously fought to survive. So the famous words of the Ottoman Interior Minister Talat Pasha to the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau, he said of the Armenians, they can live in the desert, but nowhere else. And by this, he meant they would be killed on the way, or they would go there and they would die in the desert in this harsh environment. The environment does the dirty work of massacre it also has a kind of exculpatory force, right? Natural causes. Locusts also figured prominently in a metaphorical and a material sense in a lot of these events. So the Armenian patriarch Zavendaryagyan, for example, when he pled with his government colleagues to stop the deportations, he justified his argument in part based on the idea that the Jazira was uncivilized. He said that it was populated by tribes that, quote, wipe out like locusts everything on their way. Bahram Dadrian had a more direct experience of locusts. On the path of deportation, he saw the insects and he wrote in his memoir, quote, weren't we a lot like those creatures, scattered everywhere, abandoned on every road, while bloody heels crush us without mercy and kill us. And you can see from this map here, this is based on a map put together by a German locust killing team. That this is what they identified as the permanent locust habitat. These are spaces that they see as ones in which locusts are migrating into. And this is, of course, distinct from what's going on, what we know about what's happening in Lebanon and Palestine and Syria at this time. 1915 is, of course, known as the year of the locust, right? That's a different species of locust that's coming. It's separate from this one that appears so regularly in the Jazira. There was another way that locusts were in complicated ways involved in the genocide, which is that this German team that studied these issues, they concluded that that the conscription of the war and the deportations of the genocide actually made the locusts worse during the war, because all of a sudden all these fields were fallow, and this essentially opened up space for locusts to lay more eggs and have stronger swarms. Here are some images of genocide survivors. This is from the League of Nations archive in Geneva, and this is a League of Nations orphanage in Aleppo in the 1920s, and these are children who survived the genocide and then came to Aleppo trying to find their families. In some cases they did. In some cases they went back to the Jazira and stayed there. The fellow on the right, Avakian, his story is that he had a lot of camels out in the Jazira, and he had lived there among, I can't remember if he was with the Shamar or the Anaza, and he was going to stay there. That was his life. So there is this kind of story of assimilation alongside the genocide and its violence. But what I want to talk about now is perhaps the most striking example of the unexpected encounters in the Jazira between the genocide and locusts, and that's the case of Ohanes Toros Dumanian. And I have my colleague Khachik Mouradian to thank for passing on his memoir from the Nubarian Library in Paris. Dumanian was trained as an agronomist, and when he was deported with his family to Aleppo in 1915, he managed to use his agricultural training to make a connection with a German locust expert in the region, likely using an assumed name to conceal his Armenian identity. He then proceeded to become the chief Ottoman locust control expert in the Jazira. In his memoir, Dumanian wrote of pride at protecting the crops in this region, describing how his team deployed arsenic compounds that ensured that, quote, when locusts ate them, they would die. But as Dumanian engaged in the work of locust extermination, he could not avoid encountering the work of Armenian extermination ongoing around him. On one occasion, he noticed people wearing clothes that he was sure had been taken from Armenian bodies. On another, on the way to a locust control meeting, he witnessed mutilated bodies being fed on by vultures. On still another occasion, he met an Armenian man begging for help. Dumanian made sure he was out of earshot from his colleagues, and when he felt like he was safe, he disclosed to the man that he was Armenian, and he shepherded him shepherded him to safety. So there's a way here that the metaphorical and the real are all blurred, as people found a way to survive in this place that was once the site of nomadic sedentarization campaigns and then became the killing fields of the genocide, a place that was blamed for being a desert and then also used for being a desert, a place in which alternately people disappeared into or were made to disappear. So before closing, I want to offer a few glimpses of these dynamics of borders, environment, and moving people in the wake of World War I. So when the region that was once the Ottoman Jazira became the French mandate of Syria, the British mandate of Iraq, and the Republic of Turkey, borders took on new meaning, of course, but they also weren't entirely new. People were negotiating borders of provinces, and state officials were trying to close the gap between borders and the environment and the way people moved in it for decades. Another continuity after the rupture of Sykes-Picot was locusts. So here's a map of the invasions of the Moroccan locust in part in, I think this is from 1931. And all of these dots over here are sites where they were finding eggs. And so you can see how it's especially clustered along the border between Turkey and Syria. The border, which I mentioned at the beginning, is based on this railroad line. So there's a way that locusts are continuing to fly across borders. They're also catalyzing similar kinds of fights between officials about whose fault they are. So at one point, the British in Iraq even insisted that there was a specific species of Iraqi locust, which of course was not true at all. It was just a way for them to suggest it wasn't their fault what was happening in Syria and Turkey. A significant change, however, was the increasing use of arsenics as pesticides. And of course, there's a much longer history or longer story here to be told about chemicals from World War I being repurposed to kill insects in the interwar period. So what happens here? These substances, along with expanding cultivation, they allow states to essentially dislodge locusts from their footholds across the Jazira. Of course, at the same time, these substances had impacts on humans, and they also had impacts on humans who had for long been compared to locusts. So when arsenics were sprayed, they hurt nomads' flocks, and in some cases, nomads themselves, which made the comparison of people to locusts at once corporeally real and painful. And this is a story of post-Ottoman states and borders different than the conventional one that we know, that being of colonial officials and nationalist leaders in capital cities. This is one in which nations emerged not simply from those strokes of the pen and newspaper editorials, but rather from clouds of sodium arsenite, the same substance used by different state officials, the clouds of which drifted across borders. So much so that you might not have been able to see them, you might even have forgotten them. It's in these instances of integrated disconnection that we can begin to see the post-Ottoman Middle East and its people in new light. Thank you.
Just open it up for questions. Sam, do you want to take, yeah. Just open it up for anyone who has a question. Yeah.
So I couldn't quite understand the correlation between the movement of people and the locusts because I have no background in the environmental history. So do they go with people? Do they move on their own? Like, are they like moving independently? So because you kept talking about these movements, but how they are correlated?
Yeah, so what do they look like? There is a way that there's this kind of broader structural relationship between humans and locusts, which is that when cultivation is expanding into regions that are not cultivated, it seems like locust invasions get worse. And then, of course, another aspect of this is if you're a nomad, you can respond fairly flexibly to locusts, right? You can move your flock of sheep or flock of camels. You can't move your field of cotton. Those are two places that we might see that relationship. On the one hand, how this kind of expansion of cultivation into a non-cultivated region, that's essentially concentrating nutritional value for locusts. And on the other hand, how it makes a lot of sense to be a nomad in this context.
Yeah, earlier in the presentation, you talked about the pistachio, and that's quite illuminating, looking at how these are the common geographies. And under the Ottoman Empire, there was some formal and official connection where an environmental concern like this could be dealt with in a common way. But after the Ottoman Empire, during the Mandate era, and after the Turkey as a nation state was established, do we find that cooperation between the nation states in environmental, in these environmental situations, and like natural disasters, basically? Yeah, so that's what I'm interested in, how did this dynamic change after the nation states?
Yeah. So after the Ottoman Empire, are people getting along in terms of that?
Not getting along, but it's sort of a necessity if there's something like that.
So the short answer is no. But what's interesting to me is that everyone's doing the same thing. They're using they're almost using exactly the same mix of pesticides. And so there's something about that technology that, you know, it can be deployed separately, and there's really no coordination. So there's an organization based in Damascus for a few years for coordination on handling locusts, and the transcripts of their meetings it's just a comedy of errors. It's, you know, the person presiding over the meeting has not sent in their dues for the year. You know, we don't know what place name you're referring to because there are 5 different ways of spelling it. So there are all these ways that it seems like it would, you know, force some kind of cooperation, but it's not really happening.
Yes, yeah, I have a couple questions. One, I mean, one of the things you talked about was like all the speaking about locusts, not just the locust speaking, right? And I was curious whether you're drawing on sources like myth, oral history, music, religion. I mean, to think about the ways in which a locust kind of speaks or lives in these places. And then another question unrelated to that, and this is completely out of my area, right? But land reform, is it like land reform or land reclamation part of what's going on in this region at this period? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in terms of speaking about locusts, there are all these peasant songs about, you know, bringing the starling to intervene on their behalf. I think one of the more amusing sources I found was a short-lived satirical magazine that appeared in Istanbul in 1911. And it was called Locust Magazine. And the premise was that the locust and the starling are friends, and they kind of make fun of the daily events. And there's one in particular where they're discussing the locust destruction law. And the locust says, aren't you bothered? Like, I'm your friend. And the starling has a classical liberal take of, you know, you take property from people, you don't respect property, and so you know, whatever you get. So there are all these ways that locusts appear. I mean, there's also a Zakaria Tamer story called "The Locust in the City," a children's book. So there are all these kinds of resonances. And in terms of landform, that's absolutely a big part of the story. 1858 is when we have the Ottoman land code, and that's key to people expanding cultivation in this region. You know, again, it happens in different ways in different places, but that's a part of the story. After the Ottoman Empire, this is also a place where leaders of these tribal confederations also end up having a lot of land. So some of the largest landholders are from the Shama, and then they become targeted by radical land redistribution efforts in the 50s and 60s in Iraq and Syria.
So I work on locusts in another region, so I have two related questions. So first I want to ask about the scale of the locust outbreak in Jazira, like how serious it is compared to the outbreaks in other regions, especially like in a global level. Is it more serious? Is it just less serious? And the second thing is, so it frustrates me when the locusts are not speaking in my sources. So yeah, I find it. So it's easy to trace them when there's outbreaks. So I really want to know about the silence. So I want to know, like, if people talk about them when they are not in there, when they're just like harmless grasshoppers. If people talk about them, do people deal with them? Are there like maybe any preventive measures they are taking? So I just want to know if you also feel this silence in the sources that's about locusts.
Well, so first of all, I need to read your dissertation to get a sense of the scale, so we can really correlate. So I'm excited for that. In terms of scale, I mean, these are serious outbreaks. So I think the most significant piece of evidence of this is, I mentioned this briefly, during the American Civil War, there's a shortage of cotton around the world, right? And we all know that this transforms Egypt in part, right? This is the time when Egypt really gets pulled into the global economy. People try to do it in the Jazira, and there are these stories between 1861 and 1865 of locusts hitting them every year, and they try to replant the cotton again and again, sometimes even 3 times in a season. So there are ways that they're kind of making impossible these transformations that we see other places. The second question was, how do you make locusts speak?
What about when they are not speaking, like when they are not in their great
Right.
Because I think most of the time they are harmless grasshoppers, but do people deal with them or talk about it or write about it when they are not that harmful?
I haven't seen that much, but my sense is that understanding of them as being the same creature, it only comes about in the 1920s from this guy Uvarov, this Russian locust expert who should have a Wes Anderson movie made about him. But so I don't know if that's part of the story, but I don't know. That's a good question.
So mine follows on hers. Were locusts particularly problematic in the Jazira, or were they interfering with human designs equally in other Ottoman lands, or indeed from Central Asia to Morocco? And then relatedly, did they have a particular fondness for cotton, or were they omnivorous when it came to crops?
So in terms of the empire as a whole, locusts famously strike around places like Izmir in Western Anatolia. However, the Jazira is by far the lowest population density in all of the empire. So being able to plow the land or kind of conscript people into burning locusts, any number of these other techniques that people use, it's essentially impossible in the Jazira. So that relationship is key into making it a kind of more serious problem there. And something I draw on are these parliamentary debates right before World War I in the Ottoman Empire. And they're trying to make a locust law for the entire empire. And repeatedly, deputies from the Jazira are saying, no, our place is different. You need to change the law according to place. So this is another instance where you see these questions of kind of imperial reform and unevenness of what it looks like manifesting. I don't know that they had a particular taste for cotton. My sense is that it's especially about the time when they appear. So March, April, May. That being the time when cotton is planted. That being the time that wheat is usually ready for harvest. And another part of the story too is that there are certain varieties of wheat that have harder glumels that locusts don't like to eat, but they don't have the same kind of high yield that kind of more export friendly ones do. So there's that tension there too between producing things that are good for export or producing things that are safe for locusts.
Is anything known about locusts in the Maghreb or Iran?
So this species of locust is called the Moroccan locust because that's the first place that the Swedish guy who named them saw them. So, but they actually live from Morocco to Central Asia. The story seems fairly similar in Central Asia. It's a question of kind of sparse habitation allowing locusts to have power. I don't know the Morocco story as well. They're also present in Iran to some extent. There's some coordination between Iran and Iraq on these questions as well. But it does seem particular.
It seems a lot like this region is on like the receiving end of understanding or building knowledge about in a Western scientific mode about locusts from the Russian scientists, the Germans, and then the British mandate and blaming it on Iraq, etc. Is it fair to say that there isn't, production of knowledge about locusts leading to the goals of eradication or cohabitation or whatever the goals might be happening in this region?
There's not production of knowledge in the sense that it's not working.
I guess my anticipation would be like, would it be a sort of colonial hinterland on the spot? Experts come and maybe learn more about the phenomenon than they knew before.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I wasn't sure if that was happening or not, or whether or not.
Yeah, I mean, you do see these British officers. They come in with the occupation of Iraq after World War I, and they say, "Look, the Ottomans. They were really lazy. They didn't do anything about this." That unsurprising. This is what they say about everything. And then you look in 1922 and 1923 at these officers on the spot, what they're saying in Mosul, and they say, this locust problem, we shouldn't even try. There's no point. Like, we can spend a lot of money and we're still going to fail. We should just not try. So there's a way there that you see a real quick turn from kind of typical colonial racism to this kind of practical fatalism, if you want to think of it like that.
Yeah, this was so fun to hear. So I had a couple questions, and you can answer neither or both or one. One was I was struck by talking about the Armenian genocide and both wanting to do justice to it, as I understand, engage with it, but how it sort of, the historiography of it tends to disembed it from this very region. And I was just curious to hear more about how in the book you do that. And the second was, it seems like you're working against, in some ways, like a grand political event. But I was curious what, if I'm misunderstanding that, or also like what, if any, role of event exists in this history.
We might have to talk more about the event one, maybe not here. In terms of thinking about the genocide and regional history, like I said, there is that state force need to prove that this thing happened, which kind of has the function of making books about the genocide. I think that's happening. That's changing now. A lot of people are doing different kinds of work on this. In terms of how I'm trying to do that in the book is simply present it as part of a bigger story. And I don't know if that addresses the event question, but maybe in presenting a kind of non-event based history that's a kind of longer term, staying in this place before and after this thing that happened, rather than going to it as the thing happens and then leaving. That's the way I try to think about it.
Yes, and thank you. So can't wait to read the book. I wanted to hear you speak more about the locust as a kind of cultural category or moral. I mean, the locust is like it's not just any other pest, right? It's like the worst. I mean, it's in the Bible, right? As like the worst pest, right? Like the locust come and black butter. I mean, and so I'm wondering about how that, you said that it's not just about the locust speaking, but people speaking on behalf of the locust or about the locust. So how does the fact that the locust is like the sort of the worst of the worst pests create a kind of impetus to action on the part of certain state actors, right? You know, when the governor of Kemper was Mosul blaming Aleppo or vice versa, but when you have this happening, how does this create a kind of possibility for state action that then is quite powerful, right? And does that play out in this story?
Yeah, I mean, one place that you see this is these kind of grumpy Ottoman governors saying, I don't know, we got to do this locust water thing again. Like, we got to bring in this water because the local people think it brings the starlings, and like don't want to piss off the peasants. Like, need to do this thing to placate them. In terms of kind of broader cultural meaning, another thing you see a lot is people blaming it on fatalism. Although, of course, I think it seems fairly logical not to want to fight these swarms that are going to win anyway. Like, what's the point of working really hard for 5 days? And so something you see, especially as arsenic is being deployed, or arsenic compounds are being deployed, is people refuse to use them. And they say that this is God's creature. We're not going to kill it.
There's some people that have a positive valence on the locust.
Yeah, I mean, a positive valence, or a concern that these pesticides are going to harm their animals. The Shamar in the 20s and 30s are saying, to the British, first you tell us we can't collect taxes on people, and now you're just poisoning our pastures. Like, what's left for us? Like, we really can't raise animals anymore with that.
Thank you so much. I have, suppose, 2 related questions. One is a little bit more about the post-war formation period, 20s and 30s, how these officials were looking at mobility across borders, particularly like when you talk about the introduction of arsenic and chemicals moving across borders, and how that may have been part of like smuggling or illicit trade economies. And then the second question I have is related to what you said about how locust swarms were treated in Izmir compared to the Jazira. And I'm wondering if that's just like a matter of practicality, if because it's more populated or more productive in Izmir, they have a different approach, or if that's something that we could maybe attribute a little bit more to like kind of theories like Ottoman Orientalism and yeah.
Thank you. So smuggling. After the British give up on their let's just not do anything plan in Iraq, they say we need to hire someone who really knows these places, these borderland regions. And they actually hire a smuggler to be their locust control officer. This guy who was smuggling tobacco for years, he's in charge of locust destruction. So that there is a way that they're aware of these broader cross-border networks, and they're trying to kind of capitalize on that. And of course, there's a ton of movement going on here. There are no fences at this point, right? So people are moving constantly, and different nomadic groups are moving across these borders. A fair amount has been written about this. In terms of the Izmir versus the Jazira comparison, I think it's population density. It's also density of cultivation. So as I said, it doesn't take much to dislodge locust eggs from the ground. If you just plow the land, it basically does the work. And so the fact that Izmir was so much more densely cultivated than the Jazira, that made a huge difference too. And that's actually the story of the United States as well. It wasn't that people figured out some great locust control scheme in, all across the Great Plains. It was just that cultivation expanded so much that it kind of rooted out these reservoirs for locusts. And I think that's at work here too.
The online audience. Thank you, Sam, for your interesting talk. Can you talk a bit more about your sources and also whether you're able to do field research in the region? Or about field research.
So sources, the real heart of it are Ottoman sources from the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, based on work in French and British state archives as well. Some periodicals from the Library of Congress, missionary archives. I mentioned the Natural History Museum in London, which has this collection on locusts. I feel like I'm forgetting some. The League of Nations archive, of course, was very important too. And what was the second part? Sorry.
About field research.
Field research, right. So it was actually really significant for me to not be able to go to this part of Syria, but to drive around this space in southeastern Turkey in 2014 and get a sense of space and distance. And in particular, there was a really long drive between Haran and Viranşehir, very small cities in southern Turkey, and a very a road under construction. So I just had to drive so slowly, and every bump I went over, I thought, the chassis is going to be destroyed by these rocks. So that gave me a lot of time to think about the environment and the space, and the lack of water in my car. I mean, the other thing about being there, and I mentioned this a little bit, but in all these small towns I was in, there were Syrian refugees. And so there was a way that, present movement across borders was very present as well. And that shaped it too.
To what extent, if any, did you need to take account of climate shifts and shocks to make sense of locust and human history in the Jazira?
So I couldn't map it on to anything. There is this sense of precipitation and climate. A more formidable scholar than me would maybe would have figured that out, but I didn't do it.
But there's a sense that locusts come with more precipitation or less. I mean, is there something?
It's only been more understood in like the last 30 years, even, and still people aren't totally sure about it. And there are also these theories just about kind of just density of locust populations that causes them to kind of erupt into these forms.
Thank you, Sam. I do not know very much about the agricultural history of the Jazira. I know now that it is pretty fertile, but what I understood from you that it is a badia, like it's a barn area. So, and you said that the locusts laid their eggs on those tilal hills. So what were they attacking then before it was, because what did you say it was called, when was it cultivated?
I mean, like it really gets cultivated broadly in the 50s. Like that's where it really happens in the Syrian Jazira.
Then before?
And before that, it has these verdant grasses and flowers and just beautiful wildflowers. And there's actually research on that saying that there are particular blends of wildflowers that locusts especially like. So that's what they would consume.
So when the land was cultivated, because what I understood from you is that it was enough to plow the soil to basically get rid of the eggs.
Right. But then they would come from other places. So that was the issue, is that there's like, it's especially dangerous in these uneven situations, right? Where you're expanding cultivation because, there aren't going to be locusts in the actual field that you've plowed and cultivated, but they're going to be right here.
That's where the lazy governor comes in.
Exactly, yeah, lazy governor mostly.
So a large coordination was indeed necessary.
Yeah.
And you see continuity in the failure of doing this coordination
I do, yeah.
during the Ottoman and after during the nation state.
I do, yeah, and until I mean, they're still striking in the 40s, and it seems like by the 50s that it really stops, although different species of locusts from other places periodically desert locust.
More questions?
Can you tell us about the choice for the cover? The old locusts look pretty, like pretty nice and like friendly on that.
You know, first of all, I should say all credit for the cover goes to Meredith Sadler, who's a wonderful graphic designer and artist, who also did the maps for the book. I wanted it to convey locusts, but I also didn't want it to be disgusting. And if you look around 19th century drawings of like scientific drawings of locusts, which are like green and brown and yellow, I made a judgment call that I didn't want this book that I put a lot of time into to look like that. Is it okay with you? Sure.
Look like fireflies almost. All right, on that note. There's one more question. Go ahead.
So I can't wait to read the book. Thank you so much for the great talk and the work that you're doing. So when the locusts in the Jazira become gregarious and begin to swarm, do they swarm beyond the Jazira, or are they satiated and satisfied by the wildflower?
So it's around this region. They don't go that far. So, you know, if they get to Diyarbakir, that's about as far as so that's, you know, expanding a little bit beyond the Jazira, but not much.
They reached Aleppo, did they?
There's a story about Jeddah Pasha catching them in his fez.
I remember one of the sources I read that the British consul in Damascus was complaining that those lazy and unstrategic Ottomans and also the peasants that first they got the cholera and they got killed because of the disease, and then they did not manage to get rid of the locusts, and then the harvest was basically screwed. So lazy they are.
Similar ways of thinking about outbreaks of, you know.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question following up on that? I mean, how did people manage locusts before this period? I mean, was there a sense of like, or was it this fatalism that you talked about? Like, this is not something we have control over and we just need to cut our losses. Okay.
It sounds like it didn't matter until you start cultivating.
Yeah, until you really.
Because once, if you're pastoral, it's not a big deal unless you actually cultivate the soil.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't overemphasize that point, right? Because it causes, you know, it's not like nomads don't have pastures they want to go to and kind of claims to them, but there is, yeah. That's true.
And nomads are sometimes planting too, right? Because they're semi-nomadic and they're, yeah.
But in other areas, there were like local initiatives to mobilize children, mobilize all sorts of people to go and collect them. Right. So basically the geography of the
lack of people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We can't wait to read the book.